The water was still. Too still. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Nobody screamed. The entire world seemed to press pause, as if even time itself couldn't believe what it was witnessing in that enormous, sun-drenched courtyard of the most expensive private estate in all of Connecticut. A 2-year-old boy, face down, in 12 feet of crystal blue water. Blind. Helpless. Sinking. And then, from across the stone pathway, from beside the garden shed where she had been quietly playing with a rubber duck and a handful of grass, a barefoot little girl, no older than 3, wearing a faded yellow dress 2 sizes too big, dropped everything she was holding and ran. Not walked. Ran. Toward the water. Toward the danger. Toward the boy that nobody else had reached yet. What happened in the next 60 seconds would be captured on the estate's security cameras. It would be watched by doctors, by emergency responders, by child psychologists who would later call it one of the most extraordinary moments they had ever witnessed in their careers. It would also completely destroy a billionaire's understanding of what it means to be human. Because when Marcus Hale, 35 years old, founder of a $12 billion technology empire, the man who believed he could buy solutions to every problem life threw at him, when he finally pulled his son out of that water and pressed his ear to the boy's tiny, motionless chest and heard nothing, absolutely nothing, it was not a doctor who saved the day. It was not the 3 security guards who were already reaching for their phones. It was not the estate's private nurse, who was still running across the lawn. It was Rosa, 3 years old, the maid's daughter. A child who had never taken a swimming lesson, never watched a first aid tutorial, never been told what to do when someone stops breathing. And yet, what she did next made a billionaire fall to his knees and weep in a way he had not wept since the night his wife took her last breath in a hospital room 4 floors above the NICU where their newborn son lay alone in the dark, already losing his sight. Stay with us, because this story is only just beginning. Before we go any further, we have to ask, where in the world are you watching this right now? Are you in the United States? Maybe curled up on your couch after a long day, looking for something that reminds you why people are still worth believing in? Are you in the United Kingdom, perhaps sitting by a window with rain coming down outside, needing a story that warms something deep inside you? Are you watching from Canada or Australia, where it might be early morning and you haven't even had your coffee yet, but something made you click on this video? Maybe you're in India, watching on your phone between everything life is asking of you today. Or Germany, or Nigeria, or the Philippines, somewhere across this wide and complicated world where good stories still matter. Drop your country in the comments right now. Just the name. Just where you're from. Because stories like this one, stories about children, about grief, about the unexpected grace that shows up in the most unlikely places, these stories belong to all of us, no matter where we are. Tell us you're here. We want to know. And now let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand what happened at that pool, you have to understand the man who owned it. You have to understand Marcus Hale. You have to understand what he had already lost before that terrible afternoon arrived. Marcus Hale did not grow up wealthy. He grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, with a mother who worked double shifts at a diner and a father whose name appeared only once in his life, on a birth certificate that Marcus eventually stopped looking at because the absence hurt more than the paper. He was the kind of child who figured things out alone, who learned early that needing people was the fastest way to be disappointed by them, who decided, somewhere around the age of 9, sitting on the fire escape of their building watching his mother trudge home at midnight with aching feet and tired eyes, that one day he would build something so enormous that nobody would ever be able to take anything from him again. He was brilliant in the way that lonely children sometimes are, not because they are taught, but because thinking is the only company they have. By 16, he was writing code that his high school computer teacher couldn't understand. By 22, he had dropped out of Carnegie Mellon with a half-finished degree and a fully formed idea that would become the architecture behind one of the most used cloud computing platforms in the world. By 28, Forbes had his face on their cover. By 30, he had more money than he could spend in 40 lifetimes. And he was still alone. Not in the surface way. He had assistants and advisors and business partners. He had a chef who prepared his meals and a driver who knew his schedule better than he did, and a security team that shadowed him everywhere he went. He lived inside a structure of constant human presence. But the walls were up, had always been up, and the people around him knew better than to try climbing them. Then he met Elaine. She was not impressed by him. That was the first thing that caught his attention. This woman at a charity dinner in New York who, when told that the man beside her had founded Hale Technologies, simply nodded and asked him what he actually cared about. Not what he built, not what he owned. What he cared about. He remembered staring at her for a full 5 seconds before answering, because nobody had ever asked him that, and he realized in that moment that he wasn't entirely sure he knew. He found out, over the months that followed, that she had a way of doing that, of asking the question underneath the question, of finding the soft place inside a hard thing. She was a pediatric occupational therapist who worked with children who had sensory processing disorders. She had grown up in a family that had very little money and an enormous amount of love, and she wore that background not as a wound, but as a kind of warmth that came off her like heat from a fireplace. Marcus had never met anyone like her. He married her 14 months after that dinner. For 3 years, they were happy in a way Marcus had no framework for. He kept waiting for it to be taken away. She kept laughing at him for waiting. She had this laugh, bright and a little surprised, like joy always caught her slightly off guard, and he fell asleep to the sound of it more nights than he could count, lying in the dark of their bedroom in the Connecticut estate he had bought the year before they met, thinking that this, finally, was what all of it had been for. She got pregnant in the spring of their 3rd year together. The pregnancy was difficult from the beginning. Elaine, who approached everything in life with steadiness and grace, moved through the complications with the same quality she brought to everything else, present, practical, not pretending things were fine when they weren't, but also not surrendering to fear. Marcus, who had spent his entire adult life solving problems with money and strategy, found himself standing at the edge of something that neither resource could touch. He hired the best specialists in the country. He had a private medical team on call around the clock. He did everything a man of his resources could do. It was not enough. Their son arrived 8 weeks early, in a flurry of emergency decisions and hushed voices and the terrible fluorescent light of an operating room that Marcus was not allowed inside. He waited in a hallway that felt like the longest hallway he had ever stood in, and when the doctor came out and told him that the baby was alive but that Elaine had, he didn't hear the rest of the sentence. He didn't need to. He already knew. The baby, the tiny, impossibly small boy that Marcus would name Eli, after Elaine's father, spent the next 6 weeks in the NICU. Doctors discovered during those weeks that the complications of the premature birth had resulted in damage to Eli's optic nerves. He would never see. He would grow up in a world of darkness, navigating everything by sound and touch, and the particular intelligence that children develop when one sense is taken and the others compensate. Marcus visited the NICU every single day. He sat beside the incubator in a chair too small for his frame and looked at his son through the plastic walls and felt something he had no name for, something that was love and terror and grief all braided together so tightly he couldn't separate one strand from another. He brought Eli home to the estate on a Tuesday in October, under a sky so blue it almost looked artificial. There was no celebration. There was no one waiting to welcome them. Just Marcus, and a baby, and a house that had always been too large and now felt like it was made entirely of silence. He hired a full team to care for Eli. The best neonatologist in New England made monthly house calls. A specialist in visual impairment came weekly to work with Eli on sensory development. A pediatric nurse lived on the estate full-time. Marcus built a world around his son that was structured and safe and staffed by the most qualified people he could find. But at night, when the estate was quiet and Eli was sleeping in the nursery down the hall, Marcus sat in his office with the lights off and understood something he would not say out loud to anyone for a very long time. He did not know how to be someone's father. He had never been taught. Nobody had shown him. And the woman who might have, the woman who would have known exactly how to reach through his walls and remind him that love is not a problem to be solved or a system to be optimized, was gone. He kept his walls up. He kept everyone at a professional distance. And he hired, among many others, a woman named Carmen Reyes to help manage the household. Carmen came with a 3-year-old daughter named Rosa. Marcus barely registered this detail at the time. He would spend the rest of his life understanding that it was the most important thing that had ever happened to him. Carmen Reyes had not always needed this job so badly. There was a time not so long ago, really just far enough away to feel like it belonged to a different woman, when her life had a shape she recognized. A small house in Hartford. A husband named Daniel who worked in construction and came home in the evenings smelling of sawdust and sweat, and who made Rosa laugh by pretending his hard hat was a spaceship. A life that was modest and sometimes tight and absolutely full. Daniel died on a Wednesday morning in February, 18 months before Carmen applied to work at the Hale estate. A structural accident on a job site. He was 31 years old. Rosa was 18 months old and did not yet have a word for what had happened, only a look she sometimes got, a searching, confused expression, scanning the doorway at the time of day when her father used to come home. That broke Carmen's heart cleanly in two every single time she saw it. The grief was enormous. Carmen did not hide from it. She had been raised by a mother who believed in sitting with hard things rather than running from them, who said that grief was just love with nowhere to go yet, and Carmen held that idea close in the weeks and months after Daniel died, let herself feel the full weight of what had been taken, cried when she needed to cry, and got up every morning because Rosa needed her to get up. But the finances were devastating. Daniel had life insurance, but it was modest, and it was gone faster than Carmen had expected. The house payment did not pause for mourning. Rosa needed things. Carmen's own mother was aging and needed help. There was no family money, no safety net, no one to call who could simply make the numbers work. Carmen had a degree in hospitality management and 8 years of experience in domestic service. She was meticulous and warm and reliable. She applied to every position she could find. She applied to the Hale household with a 1-paragraph cover letter that said, very simply, that she was a hard worker who had known difficulty and that she understood what it meant to be trusted with someone's home and someone's family, and that she would not let that trust down. Marcus's estate manager called her the next day. She was told, before her first day, that the situation was particular, that Mr. Hale was private, that the household operated on strict professional standards, that she was welcome to bring her daughter on days when childcare arrangements fell through, provided the child remained quiet and stayed in the staff quarters or the East Garden. That Mr. Hale did not engage personally with domestic staff, and that this was simply how things were. Carmen understood all of this. She had worked in wealthy households before. She knew the architecture of distance that money sometimes builds. She brought Rosa on her first day because the babysitter had canceled, settled her daughter in the East Garden with a bag of toys and a sandwich, and went inside to begin learning the rhythms of the largest house she had ever worked in. Rosa took to the garden immediately. This was something about Rosa that Carmen had noticed early and never quite stopped marveling at. Her daughter's ability to be completely content in her own company, in the presence of growing things, in the particular universe of a child who has not yet been told that some things are not worth paying attention to. Rosa would spend hours in that East Garden, talking to the flowers in a language that was partly English and partly sound, arranging pebbles into patterns that Carmen would discover in the evenings and photograph on her phone because they were genuinely beautiful, picking up leaves and turning them over and over in her hands like she was reading something written on them. She was a serious child in certain moments and wildly silly in others. She had Daniel's laugh, sudden, total, the kind of laugh that took her whole body. She was still learning words, and sometimes invented ones when the right one didn't come quickly enough. She was afraid of loud music and completely unafraid of insects and deeply, devotedly attached to a stuffed elephant she called Bumpy, whose trunk had been re-sewn by Carmen 3 times. And she was, without either of them knowing it yet, moving steadily toward the most important moment of her small life. Eli Hale lived on the other side of the estate. Carmen knew about him the way she knew about most things in that house, through careful observation and the occasional quiet exchange with the nurse, Sophia, who was warm and forthcoming in the way that people become when they spend most of their days in the company of someone who struggles. Sophia had told Carmen, during the second week, that Eli was doing well in terms of his health, that he was a bright and tactile little boy who loved music and hated wool and had recently started saying a small collection of words with enormous enthusiasm. She also told Carmen that Marcus Hale struggled, in a way that fathers who are present in body but not yet in spirit sometimes do, and that the house could feel it the way a house always feels the emotional temperature of the people inside it. Carmen absorbed this. She did not comment on it. She did her work with the same thoroughness she brought to everything, and she watched, and she waited, and she thanked God every night for the job, and she kissed her daughter's forehead and told her that Poppy would always love her from wherever he was. And Rosa listened and nodded and held Bumpy tight and went to sleep in the small room that had become their room, in the house that had become their temporary world. 3 weeks into the job, Rosa discovered the fountain in the East Garden, a small decorative one, not the pool, filled with pennies that guests had thrown over years of parties Marcus no longer hosted. She sat beside it for most of the afternoon, dropping a single pebble in and watching the ripples. She did not know, then, that water would soon become the center of the most important story of her life. None of them did. It started with a sound. Eli heard Rosa before he ever encountered her in any other way, which was fitting, perhaps, because sound was the medium through which he understood the world most deeply. He was in the courtyard near the east wing, walking carefully along the stone path with one hand trailing the low garden wall in the way he had learned to navigate outdoor spaces, when he stopped moving entirely. From somewhere nearby, a voice was singing. Not real singing, exactly. More like the sound a child makes when they're completely alone, and the music is coming from inside them, tuneless and unself-conscious, and somehow more melodic for it. A little girl's voice, rising and falling over some wordless, invented melody, punctuated by the sound of something small dropping into water, and the soft splash that followed. Eli stood still for a long moment. Then he turned toward the sound and walked toward it. Sophia, his nurse, was 3 steps behind him at all times in outdoor spaces, a precaution that Marcus had insisted on from the beginning, and that Sophia honored without making Eli feel contained by it. She watched him turn and took a quiet step forward and then stopped, because she recognized that specific quality of attention in Eli's small body, that particular stillness that meant he had found something interesting and was deciding what to do about it. He reached the edge of the fountain garden and stopped. The singing stopped too. Two children, aware of each other's presence, taking the measure of each other in the way that only very small children and very old animals do, without performance, without social calculation, just a pure and direct assessment. "Hi," Rosa said. She had been studying him. Her head was tilted slightly to one side. "Hi," Eli said back. Rosa looked at the fact that his eyes did not quite find her face. She had seen this before. There was a boy in the apartment building where they used to live who had the same quality of gaze, directed at sound rather than sight. She was 3 years old and did not have the vocabulary for what blindness was, but she understood, in the direct and uncomplicated way of children, that this boy heard her better than he saw her. So she made more sound. She dropped another pebble into the fountain. Eli's face oriented immediately toward the splash, a smile arriving on it so swiftly and completely that Sophia, watching from the path, felt her chest tighten. Rosa made a decision. She reached into her pile of pebbles and held one out toward where she calculated Eli's hand to be. She misjudged the distance slightly. The pebble dropped. Eli heard it hit the stone and crouched immediately, searching with his hands. Rosa crouched too. Their hands found the pebble at the same time. Neither let go. They both crouched there over this small piece of gravel, hands overlapping, for a full 3 seconds. Then Rosa laughed. Sudden, total, Daniel's laugh, and Eli laughed back, surprised and delighted, and Sophia pressed her hand over her mouth and looked away for a moment because she was not going to cry in front of 2 toddlers, but it was a near thing. After that, they found each other every day. It became the rhythm of the late afternoons. Rosa in the East Garden. Eli permitted to walk to the garden wall with Sophia watching from a careful distance, the two of them inventing a shared language that was partly words and partly sound, and partly the simple proximity of 2 small people who had, without discussing it, decided to be companions. Rosa learned quickly that Eli navigated by sound, and she accommodated this with a naturalness that no adult had ever managed quite as well. She always announced herself, always made some small noise before touching him, always described things in terms of how they sounded, or felt rather than how they looked. She brought him things from the garden to touch. A smooth stone, a rough piece of bark, the velvety face of a pansy. Eli, in turn, brought Rosa into his world of careful attention. The way he could identify a bird by its call, the way he knew from footstep patterns who was coming before they arrived, the way he could tell from the quality of an echo whether space was open or enclosed. He was 2 years old, and he navigated the world with a precision that was both heartbreaking and magnificent, and Rosa watched him with the focused admiration of someone recognizing something extraordinary. Marcus watched none of this directly. He was told about it by Sophia, who reported the daily developments with a warmth she couldn't entirely contain, how they had developed a game involving pebbles and the fountain, how Eli had started saying Rosa's name clearly and with obvious anticipation on the days he was brought outside, how Rosa had begun bringing Bumpy to the garden wall and pressing the stuffed elephant into Eli's hands, and then watching his face with an expression Sophia described as maternal, though she was only 3. Marcus listened to these reports with his usual unreadable expression and said nothing, and Sophia was never entirely sure whether the information reached him or simply disappeared into the great controlled silence he maintained around himself. It reached him. It reached him in the way that most things reach people who have built walls, not over them, but under them, through the foundations, slow and inevitable as water finding its level. He started looking at the security monitor for the East Garden in the evenings. He watched the footage of the 2 children at the fountain wall. He watched his son's face in those recordings, animated, joyful, turned toward sound with an aliveness that Marcus rarely saw during Eli's indoor hours, and felt something shifting in him that he could not have named and would not have admitted to. He did not go to the garden.
He should have.
He would spend a long time after everything happened thinking about the weeks he wasted not going. But he watched, and something in him, some locked and dormant thing, began very slowly and quietly to wake. It was a Sunday in July when it happened. The kind of July day that Connecticut produces at its most lavish, sky an impossible saturated blue, air thick and warm and smelling of cut grass and chlorine and the distant suggestion of the ocean. The kind of day that makes people believe the world is fundamentally generous. The pool was in the central courtyard of the estate, a vast rectangle of still blue water surrounded by imported stone and carefully trimmed hedges. It was ordinarily accessible only to Marcus himself and, occasionally, supervised visiting guests. Eli was not permitted near it without multiple members of the care team present. There were physical barriers, low walls, a gate with a code, designed to prevent any accidental access. That morning, a visiting contractor had been on the estate since early hours, doing work on the eastern gate system. He had temporarily removed a section of the low perimeter barrier near the pool's north edge to run new wiring. He had intended to replace it immediately. He had received a phone call. He had stepped away for what he believed would be 3 minutes. It was longer than 3 minutes. Sophia had taken a rare morning off, her first in 6 weeks, authorized by Marcus and covered by the secondary nurse, Patricia, who was newer to the household and less familiar with Eli's particular way of moving through outdoor spaces. Patricia had received a call from her own agency at 10 in the morning and stepped inside to take it, fully intending to be back outside within 90 seconds. Eli had been standing near the fountain garden. He was not there when Patricia came back outside. The timing, when investigators would later piece it together, was something like this. Eli had heard a bird, a mockingbird, it turned out, that had been singing from the hedge near the pool's north edge for the better part of the morning. He had heard it and turned toward it and begun walking, one hand trailing the garden wall as he always did, following the sound with the absolute confidence of a child who has learned that the world makes sense if you listen to it carefully enough. The gap in the barrier was exactly at hip height for an adult. For a 2-year-old, it was simply not there. He didn't feel the ground end. The stone path extended to within inches of the pool's edge and then stopped, and Eli's trailing hand lost the wall, and he took 2 more steps on momentum alone, and then there was nothing under his right foot, and then he was in the water. The pool was 12 feet deep at the north end. Eli did not know how to swim. Rosa was in the east garden, 30 feet away, on the other side of the hedges. She had been playing her pebble game alone, waiting for the afternoon hour when Eli usually came out, when she heard the sound. She would not have been able to describe it afterward. She was 3, but something in the quality of the sound, the particular splash, the absence of the laughing or the calling out that should have followed a splash, registered in her body before it registered in her mind. She was on her feet and running before she was conscious of having decided to run. She came through the gap in the hedges, through the gap in the barrier, that terrible absent gap, and she saw the water, and she saw Eli at the surface, arms moving in the uncoordinated, desperate way of a child who has no swimming skills and is using only instinct, and she did not hesitate. She was 3 years old, and she could barely swim herself. Carmen had taken her to a community pool twice that summer, and she had learned to kick and to keep her face up and nothing more. But she grabbed the long-handled pool net that was leaning against the hedge wall where the contractor had left it, and she shoved the net end toward the water in Eli's direction. The net was too short to reach him. She did not stop. She made a sound, loud, sharp, a sound that was part his name and part just sound, volume she had never used before, And then she did what 3-year-old should never do, what every safety guideline says not to do, what pure untrained instinct drove her toward. She jumped in. She grabbed Eli's arm. She kicked. She could not pull him to safety. She was 38 pounds and panicking, and the deep end of a pool was no place for her. But she held his arm and she kicked, and she kept his face above water by fractions of inches, and she screamed, the same sharp sound, over and over, until Patricia came bursting through the hedge at a dead run and went in after them both. Marcus was in his office on the second floor. He heard Rosa scream. He did not process the sound consciously. He was already moving before he understood why. Some animal part of him, the part that the walls had never quite reached, responding to a child's distress call with a velocity that bypassed thought entirely. He was down the stairs and through the side door, and across the courtyard in seconds that he would later be unable to account for. Patricia had Eli at the pool's edge. She was lifting him out. Eli was not moving. Marcus took his son from Patricia's arms with a force that was not rough but absolute. He pulled the boy against his chest and felt the terrible limpness, the absence of resistance, and then put Eli on the stone poolside and pressed his ear to the small chest. Nothing. Silence. The kind of silence that reaches into a person and takes hold of something fundamental and begins pulling. Marcus had taken a first aid course 12 years ago. He remembered almost nothing of it. His mind was white and roaring and completely useless in this moment. His hands were shaking. Patricia was already on the phone with emergency services. Marcus looked at his son's face, pale, still, the long eyelashes against the cheeks, the mouth slightly open, and felt every wall he had ever built dissolve completely. There was nothing left. No strategy. No resources. No protection. Just a father kneeling on wet stone with his hands shaking and his son not breathing, and the entire $12 billion completely worthless, less than worthless, not even a real thing. He pressed his hands to Eli's chest and started compressions. He was doing it wrong. He could tell he was doing it wrong. He didn't know the right force, the right rate, the right anything. Patricia was still on the phone, relaying instructions, trying to get to Marcus, still holding Rosa, who was shaking and soaking wet and making small sounds that were not quite crying. And then Rosa stopped making those sounds. She looked at Eli on the stone. She looked at Marcus's shaking hands. She looked at Eli's face. And she did something that no one in the courtyard expected. No one who watched the security footage later expected. No child psychologist or first aid expert or pediatric specialist who was subsequently shown the footage could fully explain it in any term that didn't eventually come back to the same word. Love. She made Patricia put her down. Not asked. Not requested. She pushed against Patricia's arms with a firmness that was completely at odds with the trembling of her small body and said, in a voice that was wet and shaking but absolutely clear, "Down. Down now." And Patricia, stunned and still holding the phone, loosened her grip, and Rosa's bare feet hit the stone poolside. She walked to Eli. Marcus was still doing compressions, hands shaking, jaw set, tears streaming down his face in a way he was completely unaware of. He didn't see Rosa approaching. He was somewhere inside the tunnel of terror, the narrowed world of a parent watching a child not breathe, and nothing outside that tunnel existed. Rosa knelt down beside Eli's head. She put her small hands on either side of his face. And she talked to him. This is what the security footage showed, and what made the child psychologist pause, and what made grown emergency responders watch it multiple times with expressions they couldn't quite neutralize. A 3-year-old girl, soaking wet, shaking, kneeling beside a 2-year-old boy who was not breathing, and talking to him. not crying at him, not calling his name in panic, talking to him in the low, intimate, completely serious voice she had used in the garden every afternoon when they played together. The voice she used when she described things to him, when she narrated the world for him, because she understood in her instinctive 3-year-old way that his world was built of sound and voice and nearness.
She said, "Eli."
"It's Rosa. I'm right here," she said. "Eli, I hear you. I hear you." She said his name over and over, in that low, sure voice, her hands cradling his face, while Marcus kept compressing and Patricia kept relaying instructions, and the whole courtyard held its breath. Eli coughed, not dramatically, not like the movies. A small, convulsive, wet cough, water moving, lungs claiming their function back, the body remembering what it was made to do. Then another. Then a sound that was partway between a cough and a cry, the specific confused protest of a child waking into a situation it doesn't understand. Marcus stopped compressions. He pressed his ear to Eli's chest. Heartbeat. Breathing. Both. He made a sound that he would never be able to describe later. Something that came from a place in him that had no name, that had been sealed for 2 years, that Rosa had cracked open with her bare hands and her 3-year-old courage and her impossible certainty that if she called her friend's name in the right voice, he would hear her. He gathered Eli against him, carefully, perfectly, with a tenderness that seemed to come from nowhere and was actually the most natural thing he had ever done, and held him while Eli cried the confused, frightened crying of a child who doesn't know what happened and only knows that he is cold and scared and something went terribly wrong. "I've got you," Marcus said. "I've got you. You're okay. I've got you." He said it over and over. He didn't stop saying it. Rosa sat back on her heels and watched Marcus hold his son, and her expression, caught perfectly on the security footage, this small soaking child with the wet yellow dress and the bare feet and the complete post-crisis exhaustion of someone who has done an enormous thing, her expression was not proud. It was not relieved in the dramatic way. It was something quieter and more profound. It was the look of someone who had done exactly what needed doing and knew it and needed nothing from that fact except that it was true. Carmen arrived at a dead run from the direction of the East Wing, having heard Rosa's screaming from inside the house. She saw her daughter sitting on the wet stone beside the Hale family. She took in the scene, the soaking children, the compressions must shirt on Marcus, the phone still in Patricia's hand, Eli alive and crying in his father's arms, and she sat down on the stone beside Rosa, right there on the wet ground, and pulled her daughter into her arms and held her without a word. The ambulance arrived 7 minutes later. Eli was examined. His lungs were clear. His vitals were strong. The near drowning had lasted less than 2 minutes, and the intervention had been fast enough. The ER doctor on call said it was about as good an outcome as you could hope for from a situation like this, and the word he used, hope, seemed to hang in the hospital corridor where Marcus stood waiting with Eli wrapped in a blanket in his arms in a way that was completely different from the way Marcus Hale had ever held anything before. He had held his son the way you hold a problem before. The way you hold something precious and fragile that you are responsible for keeping intact. Careful, managed, controlled. This was different. This was the way you hold someone you love because they are yours and you are theirs and no wall or strategy or $12 billion has anything to do with it. He held Eli all the way to the hospital, all through the examination, all the way home. In the back of the car, Eli asleep against his chest with the boneless, total trust of a small child who has found the one place in the world where they feel completely safe. Marcus looked out the window at the Connecticut evening, the long golden light, the trees beginning their slow turn toward autumn, and thought about Rosa, about what she had done, about the fact that she was 3 years old, and she had gone into that water for his son, and she had held Eli's face in her hands and called his name in the right voice, and his son had heard her and come back. He did not have words for this yet. He would need time to find them. But something had changed in the architecture of him, something permanent, something that no amount of careful management would ever reverse, and he was dimly, shakily, profoundly aware of it as the car turned through the estate gates and the lights of the house came into view. 3 weeks after the incident at the pool, Marcus Hale did something he had not done in 2 years at the estate. He knocked on the door of the staff quarters himself. Carmen answered. She looked at him the way people look at powerful private men who show up unexpectedly at their door, with a careful neutrality that holds a dozen possible responses in reserve. Marcus had thought about this moment, had prepared several versions of it, had gone over what he intended to say with the methodical thoroughness he brought to everything. And then he stood in the doorway and looked at Carmen and forgot all of it. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "for Rosa." Carmen waited. "I'm not," he stopped. Started again. "I'm not good at this. At this kind of conversation. I'm aware of that." He looked down for a moment and then back up. "Your daughter saved my son's life. She jumped into that water and held him up, and she talked to him when I didn't know how to, and he came back." His voice, which had been controlled, shifted in a way he didn't try to prevent. "I've been trying to figure out what to do with that for 3 weeks. How you acknowledge something like that. How you say what it means." Carmen's careful neutrality had softened. "She's 3, she said quietly. She didn't do it to be acknowledged." "I know," Marcus said. "That's part of what I've been trying to figure out how to say."
He paused.
"I'd like to offer to cover Rosa's education. Fully. From preschool through whatever she wants to pursue." He said it plainly, without the salesmanship he brought to professional negotiations. "Not as a transaction. Not as a payment. I understand it can't be a payment for something like this. But as," he searched for the word, "as the most direct way I can think of to say that her life matters to me. That she matters. That I know what she did, and I won't forget it." Carmen was quiet for a long moment. Inside the room, from behind Carmen, came the sound of 2 small voices, Rosa and Eli, who had begun spending their afternoons together in the staff quarters common room after Marcus had arranged it, haltingly at first, and then with the settled ease of a routine. Eli's laugh, his full, surprised, delighted laugh that Marcus had recently learned existed and had not known about before and was now possibly his favorite sound in the world, rose briefly and then dissolved back into the murmur of their play. Carmen listened to it. "Yes," she said. "Okay." Marcus nodded.
He started to turn.
"Mr. Hale," Carmen said. He turned back. She looked at him with an expression that was compassionate and direct and a little bit fierce all at once. The expression, Marcus would later think, of someone who has lost a great deal and therefore knows exactly what matters. "Those 2 children have given each other something that didn't cost either family a cent," she said. "Don't lose track of that while you're figuring out what you can do with your money." Marcus stood in the doorway for a moment. "I know," he said. "I'm learning." He meant it in the largest possible way. He started going to the garden in the afternoons. At first he watched from the path. Then he sat on the bench near the fountain wall. Then, one afternoon, Rosa looked up from what she was doing and walked over to him and placed a smooth pebble in his hand with the same matter-of-fact directness she used for everything and went back to her game. He held the pebble. On his other side, Eli reached up and found his father's arm with his hands and climbed, without ceremony, onto Marcus's lap and leaned back against his chest and began listening to the garden with that profound, absorptive attention that was uniquely his. Marcus sat between his son and this extraordinary child who had saved him and felt the specific warmth of the late afternoon sun, and did not try to solve anything or manage anything or build any protection against any future thing.
He just sat there,
Present. For the first time in 2 years, simply and completely present. He thought about Elaine. He did this differently now, not the locked-away sharp-edged grief that had lived in him since the hospital corridor, but something more open. He thought about what she would say if she could see this garden, these children, this particular afternoon. He thought she would laugh.
bright and a little surprised.
He thought she would say, "There it is. There's what all of it was for." He thought she would be right. Carmen, watching from the window of the staff quarters with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, saw the three of them on the bench, the tall, controlled man with the small blind boy on his lap and the 3-year-old girl dropping pebbles into the fountain and narrating each splash as if the world were a story she was reading aloud, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt that things could be okay. Not perfect. Not without loss or complication or the ongoing hard work of rebuilding a life after it has been taken apart. But okay in the deeper sense. Okay in the way that means the important things are still standing. She put the tea down and went back to her work. Rosa and Eli were still playing when the sun went down that evening, still at the fountain, still passing pebbles back and forth, still speaking in their private language of sound and touch and the unreasonable, unearned, unbreakable affinity of two children who found each other in the middle of two enormous griefs and decided, without knowing what they were deciding, to be each other's company. Inside the house, Marcus Hale sat down at his desk and opened a notebook, a paper notebook, which he had not used since before Elaine, and wrote one sentence at the top of the first page.
He stared at it for a long time.
Then he closed the notebook. The sentence was, "Eli has Rosa."
Start there.
It was the most important business plan he had ever written. He was only beginning to understand what it meant. But for the first time in 2 years, in the lengthening quiet of that Connecticut evening with his son's laughter still echoing off the garden walls, Marcus Hale was not afraid of what came next. He was against every odd, against every wall he had ever built, against every piece of evidence his first 35 years had given him about the nature of a world that takes things without warning or apology. He was quietly and tentatively, and with his whole broken open heart, grateful. If this story moved you, if it reminded you what matters, or made you think of someone you love, or simply gave you something to hold on to today, share it with someone who needs it. And drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We read every single one.